In Chris Hedges' book, The Death of the Liberal Class, you're quoted as saying there's a substantial shift in global power, quoting from the global workforce to transnational capital, and it's been sharply escalating during the neoliberal years. My question is, how significant do you think a constitutional amendment to repeal corporate personhood, to define persons as natural persons only, would be in slowing down or hopefully even reversing the shift in power?
Well, you know, corporate personhood is a real scandal. Corporate personhood is an interesting doctrine. I mean, it goes back to the 14th Amendment, which is very, I'm sorry to bring up too much history, but this stuff is really enlightening. You go back to the 14th Amendment right after the Civil War. Its core principle is that no person can be deprived of rights without due process of law. Actually, there's something like that in the Fifth Amendment, but this expanded it. And the intention, of course, was freed slaves. It meant freed slaves cannot be deprived of their rights. Well, it was never applied to freed slaves. Almost entirely, it was applied to corporations. They're not to be deprived of their rights without due process of law. Over the years, the concept of corporate personhood became elaborated. It wasn't really established firmly until about a century ago. And it was not done by legislation. It was courts and lawyers. And incidentally, progressives were behind it. The progressives strongly supported it. Part of their support for what were called organic institutions over more important than individuals. So Woodrow Wilson and the rest. But what it means is that the meaning of the 14th Amendment was expanded so that person included corporations. And over the years, corporations have gotten rights that are way beyond those of persons of flesh and blood. So if you go, say, to Clinton's free trade, so-called free trade agreement with Mexico, it has nothing to do with free trade, that's what it's called. It grants corporations rights that human beings can't even dream of. Like, for example, if General Motors invests in Mexico, they have to be given national treatment, meaning treated like a Mexican business. Well, that's the expansion. Of course, if a Mexican human being appears in New York and demands national treatment, we won't talk about it, but corporations have, these are among the rights that go way beyond persons. At the same time, the 14th Amendment was restricted. This concept that no person can be deprived of rights, if you take it common sense interpretation, it means that an undocumented alien can't be deprived of rights. Well, we can't have that. So the courts, in their wisdom over the years, have defined person so it doesn't include creatures of flesh and blood who don't have the right documents. Okay, so it's both, the concept's both been expanded and restricted, and that proceeds without any complaint from the originalists and so on and so forth. What about something added to that? What was added to that was in a Supreme Court case in the 70s, which determined that money is speech. Okay, so money is a form of speech. All of this stuff is incidentally supported by the ACLU and others, I should say. The free speech advocates support this. But what it means, you combine all of this, you get to Citizens United a year or two ago, which says that you can't infringe on the right of these persons, like, say, General Electric, to speak freely by spending as much money as they want to buy an election. I mean, that's the conclusion. And it was quite interesting to read the reasoning. So Justice Kennedy's, the swing vote in Citizens United, his argument was, well, look, we give other corporations the right of freedom of speech, like CBS or the New York Times, so why should we deny it to, say, General Electric and Citigroup? It's an interesting concept. It means, of course, the reason why CBS and the New York Times were granted these rights is because they're supposed to fulfill a public trust. They're supposed to provide honest, objective, informed analysis. I won't talk about how it's done, but that's the reason why they get this right. But that's gone. Kennedy's swing argument just dismissed that. If they get the right, why shouldn't General Electric get it? So here you get a really serious blow at the foundations of democracy, and that's part of the reason why election costs are sure already ridiculous. They're going to the sky. So what about a constitutional amendment? Well, there's a problem with that. The constitutional amendment requires public support, substantial public support, and that doesn't come by, going like that. You got to work on it. So there has to be a lot of organizing and educational work to build up a major groundswell of support, which will call for restoring the 14th Amendment to what the words say. I should say that back a century ago, when corporate personhood was being established by courts and lawyers, there was a lot of objection to it, and the objection came from conservatives. The term conservative still exists, but not the category. Back in those days, conservatives, classical liberals, were people who believed in classical liberal doctrines. Now people talk about them, but they don't believe in them. And the idea that a corporation should be given personal rights is a major attack on classical liberal doctrines, which held that rights inhere in persons of flesh and blood, not collectivist legal entities established by state power. So there is a conservative objection to it. And I think there's plenty of anti-corporate feeling in the country, but it's unfocused. It's confused, like almost everything in a very atomized society. So yeah, a constitutional amendment would be a great idea, I think, or maybe just legislation, but it takes an enormous amount of work to build up the popular support for it. That's the problem.